right. I'd like to call the meeting of the Shorewood Plan Commission to order at 6:33 p.m. Thank you to everyone who's here tonight. Thank you for your time, talent, and patience in advance as we conduct the work of the village. We have everyone is here except for Commissioner Trustee Kudo. I think that's the only one.
Correct.
Okay. Who is excused. And our first order of business this evening, or our second order of business, is the approval of July 26, 2022 meeting minutes.
Motion to approve. Second.
All right. Motion to approve by Commissioner Wicklund, seconded by Commissioner Pollock. Any discussion? I'll be abstaining since I was not present. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Abstention, me. And anyone opposed? No. Okay. Minutes are approved as presented. Moving on to item 3, we have a presentation of the public review draft of the commercial zoning update. For this, we have our consultant, Leslie, what's your last name again? Ulmer Holzer, here with us in person this evening. I just want to say that thank you to all the members of the working group. Not everybody is here, but of the plan commissioners, you've put in an incredible amount of time, and I really appreciate that. And I look forward to seeing the fruits of your labor this evening. Did everybody receive the email that I sent through Bart earlier? It was just given direction to, so just a note, this is not, we don't have to take any action this evening. So there won't be a reason to discuss, what's in the code and what shouldn't be in the code, because this is in the process. This is a reconnection to the Plan Commission as the overseeing body of this project. It is not, and then it transitions from here into a public review process. So before it comes back to us as a second draft or a final draft. So we are encouraged to attend the public open house and participate that way, and also to submit any comments that we have via email, and all of those will be combined as they always are, and we will always see a record of those. So for that reason, I'm not going to expect that we're going to discuss really what's in the code. I'm looking for a presentation, for clarification of terms for people who are not in the working group, questions about next steps. That's kind of the scope of what I would expect this evening. I will take public comment though for anybody that's here. So with that, I will hand it over to the team and we'll go from there.
Well, good evening. Thank you for having me here tonight. And I will say it was a pleasure working with the working group. Best working group I think I've ever had, honestly.
We strive to please here in Shorewood.
I can't believe how many people actually read the code, much less did multiple Post-it notes.
I have to do a technical assistance. You have to speak into the microphone so closely and loudly that you can hear yourself and you feel uncomfortable.
Oh, okay.
So
great.
if you're not feeling self-conscious about how loud your voice is, you are not speaking loud enough.
Okay.
Okay. And the reason for that being that the people on the Zoom and for the recording, they can't hear it if we're not speaking like this.
Right.
Could you re-compliment everyone too then? Could you re-compliment?
Yeah, I re-compliment, of course. Absolutely. Thank you so much. The best working group ever. So I'm here tonight to present to you all. It's not really not that loud.
You really, and also you have to speak right into it, so you can't make eye contact with the group.
Really hard. Okay.
I know.
I like to look at everybody.
I know.
Okay, so this is the public review draft of the document that we've been working on for several months. And what I'm going to do is very quickly kind of run you through the process. Just, I know you all have seen a bunch of these slides, but I think it's really important that we revisit some of them and make sure that, you know, we're sticking to our process. So again, my name is Leslie Oberholzer. My company is Codometrics. Kirk Bishop with Duncan Associates is having oral surgery today and couldn't be with us tonight, unfortunately. Hopefully you will see his face soon. The working group members are listed here. I think it's a really important list. And again, thank you so much for everybody's involvement. Our project scope is pretty clear. We were to write what was called a hybrid form-based code because we were also looking at use classifications very specifically. And we have done so. So I will show you that shortly. These three broad goals were in the RFP: predictable redevelopment, compatibility with existing context, aligned with community expectations. I will show you even more goals that we had for this project shortly. In terms of process and schedule, this is where we are at. This is meeting number 7 that was in our scope of work. It is a presentation of the first draft code to the Plan Commission. You know, being first draft, it's not really a first draft, it's the public review draft. The second draft, the initial draft, was the internal draft that occurred during phase 3 or task 3, drafting the hybrid form-based code, the big long green line, which was longer than we anticipated and had quite a few more meetings than we anticipated. I think the working group met 6 times. I came for 5 of those meetings. And it was, you know, again, a really excellent process. We covered a lot of ground. What we will talk about next steps towards the end. So during the first phase of the project, it was very important to take a look at your comprehensive plan because the comprehensive plan is our roadmap for everything that happens in Shorewood. Is it really supposed to have this like bumpiness to the microphone? Maybe it's just the way I speak. I know. Okay. So at any rate, the comprehensive plan, again, is very important. It creates a sort of basis for writing the new zoning. It asks to write new zoning. And then it has supporting goals and objectives included in it that we followed. The scope of work was very specifically the B zones that you have in your current code. Those are highlighted here. They're a majority of the parcels up and down Oakland Avenue and Capitol Drive. You can see that the high school is not included in this, that the church on Capitol is not included in this. Any single family zoning is not included in this. So it is just the B zones. There's actually a parcel up underneath my number 1 current map and code blue box up there at the top. And then you will also note that there are a couple of parcels along the Milwaukee River that are also included in this. One of the key steps in this sort of phase 1 of the project were listening sessions. And I had listening sessions with, I think, all of you and a lot more. Again, a first for me, the most listening sessions that I've ever had for a project, the most people involved, I should say, in listening sessions. And they were very helpful. I think you saw them in, Bart kind of outlined them in his memo to you. We met one-on-one. I think we offered to meet with all trustees, all commissioners, I think pretty much every committee that was involved, and also held a couple of group listening sessions with developers and architects and designers that were really helpful and great to kind of hear from them. This sort of one-page, what have we heard, is the expansion of the goals for the project, in my opinion. It's asking for clear, predictable regulations, simpler approval processes, high quality, appropriately scaled buildings, and affordable places for people to live. Part of that affordable places for people to live is all about a simpler approval process, a more predictable approval process, which can make developers more comfortable working with the village, but can also lower their costs in terms of review so that hopefully they can take that money and put it back in to those high quality, more durable buildings. Is it on the screen? Oh, it is on the screen. Yeah, yeah. And then lastly, and this is a sort of hallmark of form-based codes, is this focus on the public realm. And the focus on the public realm means that we're looking for a really high level of permeability between the sidewalk and the interiors of the buildings. That can increase vibrancy. It makes people feel more comfortable walking up and down the sidewalk. It just creates a higher level of energy up and down the corridors. Part of what we were also doing was really focusing our efforts on design and the quality of the building facades while being freer in terms of what happens on the back and sides of the facades, so that in terms of affordability, we're kind of putting the money in the public facades. So that becomes a really important element. In terms of, sort of reaching those somewhat dueling goals of affordability as well as high quality, durable, sustainable buildings. So if you have not read these, it's a one pager. It's on the website. I'm sure it's really helpful. And I just reread them before this, and I feel like it was a pretty good checklist of the kinds of things that we were aiming to do. So. Another part of that phase one was a little bit of analysis, sort of right out off the bat in the freezing cold weather, while my photographs have snow in them. I did a kind of what's on the ground along all the segments of the corridor to begin identifying building types, which is the basis for the code, the structure of the code. And so there's a little document called the Discovery Memo that outlines kind of all of the different building forms that are along all the different segments of the corridors. From that, we headed into phase two, which was the public outreach process. We held a first public workshop, which was really an introduction to form-based code. And then the second public, which was remote, because we were still in kind of COVID lockdown. The second meeting, though, was an in-person meeting at the library, and we did an image preference survey. And these are the 4 categories of images that we looked at. And I just want to draw your attention to 1 and 2, which are 2 building types, the storefront buildings and the general buildings. We showed tons of images, 100 images, and everybody sort of looked at those and scored them, then discussed them. And that gave us a lot of good information to help fold back into the code. The storefront buildings and the general buildings are 2 of the key building types in the code, which I'll show you in a few minutes. The streetscape and the facade renovations are just really a kind of a reality check. It helped us to talk a lot about the public realm in the streetscape section, and to really kind of get a better feel for what the expectation of people kind of walking up and down these corridors was. I'll talk about that in just a minute as well. Facade renovations is really a kind of a reality check. We wanted to make sure that this code was going to also work for renovations of facades, because you have so many beautiful existing buildings that get renovated that you will want to retain. The third public workshop took those building types and created a map and zoning districts. And what we did was, you really can't read anything from this, but this is one of the pages from one of the boards from the workshop. And the idea here was to really get down on the ground and ask some key questions about how different parcels should be zoned. And this helped to, again, kind of reality check where we were going. One of the key elements at this stage was to get sort of buy-in that what we really want to do is focus those storefronts, that ground floor storefront glass with storefront-like uses, retail, restaurants, services, and such, that those really active uses along specific portions of the corridors. And then to allow, that's the purple, the lavender and the darker purple, and then to allow in those light blue and dark blue areas and the orange areas, residential and office uses on the ground floor. Part of that is because every place that I've ever worked, the last 15 years is overzoned for commercial, as you all probably were at some point, and then your zoning changed with the different B zones. And the idea, again, is to really consolidate all of those storefronts together so that they're benefiting from each other and creating little districts, little mini districts of activity. And so that's what we've done on the new map. And so this workshop was a lot about that discussion and sort of getting buy-in on that. And then we had further discussions with the working group. So that was longer than I meant, but the idea there was to kind of give you the background of how we got to this public review draft. Any questions so far or no? Okay.
And I don't want to discourage, especially for members who were not involved. If you have questions, this is a great time to ask, or members of the public.
Okay, so as I said, that last public workshop included the districts and the map. So what I'm going to do is just kind of quickly walk you through those districts and then show you the map because, again, zoning districts are the structure of the code with allowed building types within them. So for those purple storefronty areas, we defined 3 zones. 2 we just call MX zones, MX1 and MX2. And the third one is CX. All 3 are named, with the word storefront in them because the main building type for those locations is, ground floor storefronts. And you can see some images of storefront buildings on the right-hand side. The CX zone allows for multi-story mixed-use storefronts, just like you see in the MX, but it also allows single-story, single-use storefront buildings with auto-oriented uses within them, for example, gas stations or drive-throughs. And there's your Chick-fil-A that we talked about on the bottom right-hand corner. So the comprehensive plan calls for those CX zones, those uses, to be in a very specific location on the west end of Capitol. And that is what we followed in the mapping. In terms of the MX1 and the MX2, the idea here is that your current zoning has the heights within the text. And when you look at the map, you don't know where those heights are. Took me a couple of times to figure out where it was. And so what we've done is we've actually created different zoning districts on the map for the different heights. So MX1 and MX2, for all intents and purposes, are the same, except for 4 stories max in MX1 and 5 stories max in MX2, consistent with your current zoning and the comprehensive plan. The next 3 zones are GX zones. Again, very similar. We've got 3 versions of basically the same. That is the GX, the G stands for general. And the idea here is if you look at the right-hand side, residential and office types of uses can occur in very similar buildings. The key here is that general buildings do not have that ground story storefront requirement. They have basically the same transparency or window patterns on the ground floor that they do in the upper stories, or the same minimum requirements. They don't have as many entrances like a storefront building would have. They can have just 1 entrance per every 100 feet or something like that. So that's the general building. In terms of GX1, 2, and 3, the maximum height for GX1 is 4.5, GX2 5.5, and GX3 8.5. And that 8.5 is at the intersection of Capitol and Oakland, just like your comprehensive plan calls for. One thing to note is that half story is, if you look at the building in the upper left-hand corner, there is what I call, and the code calls, a visible basement on it, which means that the building, the first story of the building or the ground story can be elevated just above a basement level. The storefront must be at the sidewalk level because, again, you want that permeability of moving in and out of the sidewalk into the storefront spaces. In a residential building, it might be to your advantage to have that first floor elevated a little bit so people aren't looking in the windows. So that's what that half story is on all of those heights. It just allows a half story to be elevated in the bottom, or as you can see in the upper right-hand corner, if you have pitched roofs, you could have a partial story under that roof as a half story. The RX zoning district is has the same building types. Actually, it allows for townhouse or row house buildings as well, but it is only for residential uses. And we felt very strongly with the focus on affordable housing that you have some existing residential buildings that are just off the corridor that are zoned B right now, that we really wanted to maintain as housing to be consistent with your goals of affordable housing. So that RX zone is applied in those locations where you've already got existing residential buildings. It's also on the southern portion of Oakland on the eastern side. There are a whole bunch of great missing middle residential building forms. So those are zoned RX. So this is the map, and you should have had it in your packet, right? So you can look at it in great detail, but what you'll see is we tried very hard to map all of the existing storefronts as storefronts, unless they were not really being used as storefronts. So for example, and this is a change from the working group, some of our discussion about wanting to allow like medical uses in the ground floor. So if you look at the intersection of Oakland and Capitol in that northwest corner, you'll see GX, which in those little sort of cottagey storefront buildings that you have there, kind of in front of the parking garage. The parking garage is behind them to the north. Those we made GX to accommodate the kinds of uses that are currently in them, and also because they're a little bit harder to get to and they're not consistent, in terms of walking distance with the Oakland storefronts. So anywhere where you see blue, you are not required to have a storefront. You can certainly put in more glass and have what's essentially storefront. But the storefront uses are limited to a certain percentage, because what we really want to do is concentrate those uses in the lavenderish and dark purple locations. So you can see those are very nodal, like at intersections and in little groupings to the best of our ability. The hot pink that you see on the west end are the CX. Those are the gas stations, and we very specifically asked about the gas stations in other locations. Those gas stations can continue as they are forever, but if they do change, then they will become whatever the zoning is that's shown. Another item to notice on this map is that the PDD is now hatched over all of the existing locations as a PDD overlay. And this is not in your packet because what we will be doing is a kind of, for lack of a better term, kind of a scrub of the current regulations, and this will get folded in as text within the regulations, but the working group has seen this. So this is the language to take those PDDs that are on the books right now and turn them into what Kirk calls the legacy district status, which means that they become an overlay on top of the base zoning that we've applied. In general, we're not losing anything. Very few of the PDDs, unlike most places, have design standards in them. They may have a few little adjustments or waivers or modifications that were granted, but very few of those are different from what the code that we're proposing says. So I think this is a very comfortable way to carry forward all of the other kind of management language that might be in those PDDs, while keeping them from expanding, and also if some significant change happens to those, then they would use the new base zoning. So we've gone to all this trouble to create this new code, and the code would then apply. So if something got torn down, that's a PDD right now. So that's PDDs, not my favorite topic. Okay, so just taking a look at, oh, that doesn't really read very brightly. Your current zoning, this is all the sections in your current zoning. And the only thing that I really want to draw your attention to is all the blue text that's highlighted in the bottom left-hand column, and then you see use regulations in the middle of that. Can I point? Okay, look, I can point. Use regulations in 535-10. And then we're replacing the commercial and mixed use and river districts section. We're going to move the PDD section with the language that I just showed you within that. And then conditional uses in this little cute little modification section, which is like 4 sentences, maybe 2 actually. And then special exceptions over here. So what you can see here is that we've kind of taken a chunk out of the middle, which gives us room to build our code consistent with your current zoning districts article. So taking conditional uses out gave us a whole bunch of numbers that we could work within. This was like surgery. And what we're doing is, I'm going to show you in just a second, is we're replacing that Article 5 conditional uses with another use section. I'm sorry, I'm not talking into this, am I? Okay, so you can see that. What I'm doing is creating 3 new articles nestled in the middle of that. And again, this is all information the working group has seen. It just maybe sounds a little bit different presented this way. So Article 4 that I showed you before, we're not replacing that article. We're adding to that article with sections 22, 23, 24, which are all about the commercial and mixed use zoning districts. So 21, PDD is just going to move up to 21. We're taking those 3 sections. All of 22, 23, and 24 only applies to the commercial and mixed use districts. And I'm going to show you what those have in just a minute. Article 5 uses is a new article that we're introducing in place of your conditional uses article. And the idea behind this is, instead of just having that one little nestled subsection or section on uses, we're creating an article about the uses. So all of the information about uses is in one place. And that will apply to everything. We haven't changed any of the regulations, but it will apply to everything. And it's a little bit easier to read and understand, I think. And then also in terms of procedures, you notice that I had taken special exceptions out of parking. We had the conditional use section, and then in the building code section, there was information about design review. So we've taken all of that and consolidated and created this procedures article, and I'll show you that in just a minute. Procedures article applies to everything as well. So now I'm just going to talk to you about the commercial mixed use section. So there are those 3 sections, 535, 22, 23, and 24. 535-22 introduces the zoning districts, which we just went over, and uses building types as the regulations for building form within all of the commercial and mixed use zoning districts. Building design, which is section 23, is about building design. This takes the majority of the design guidelines for the central district and turns them into regulations. And then we have landscape and site design as another section. So building types. So this is 535-22, the first one. It introduces those zoning districts that I just explained to you, the MX1, MX2, CX, GX, and RX, all shown on the zoning map. The first page, or maybe the second page, this table that you see in the bottom left-hand corner is the key to building form in the regulations. What it does is, you can see highlighted in orange, it lists 4 building types down that column, and then has all of the zones across the top and tells you which building types are allowed in which zones. So if you are developing in the MX2, you look down and it says you can only build a storefront building. If you're developing in CX, you can either develop a storefront building or a commercial building, which is very similar to a storefront building, only it's a single story building. And it's footprint is not quite as big and so on. And the same thing with the GX. If you're in GX1, you can develop a general building. If you're in GX2 or GX3, you can develop a general building or a row building, and in RX, a general building or a row building. The row building is very similar to a general building. It just requires an entrance per unit and is all about kind of side-by-side units. So it's like townhouses or row houses or live work units. So this is a really important table. If you look at, so that little formula that I put across the top, districts equals building types plus uses, there's a use table that's very similar. If you have those two tables, you know a whole lot about what you can do in your district. And those are that's just the intent language up there on this side. I'm gonna skip, you can read that. It's very consistent with the what have we heard. Each building type, the 4 building types, is regulated by 6 pages. Every one of them is formatted the same way. The first page is a description and intent, and it has images from the image preference survey. And I just realized, Scott, that we did not change out one of the images that you requested. Was it you that requested to change it? So we'll need to do that. Description and intent. Building siting, number 2, and parking siting is number 3, page 3. Height, building height is page 4, and facade requirements is page 5. And again, if you remember public realm, the facade requirements are all about the primary facade, windows and doors, and divisions. It's a very simple set of regulations associated with those. And then page 6 is about supplemental regulations. So I'll explain this in just a minute, but we have some facade variation that we've incorporated that was specific to a lot of our discussions within the working group, as well as in the public workshops, about having more variety to our street wall as opposed to just a straight shot street wall. And that is all located in that supplemental regs section. Oops, I'm starting to. So this is just to, I'm not going to go over any of those pages with you. You can read them and look at them, but just to kind of point out, within building siting, those hatches are build to zones. Your current code has a build to line, which would result in that sort of straight shot street wall, which is not really typical of the character of Shorewood. You've got a lot more push and pull and areas, spaces, along the facade. And so a build to zone allows for that. So that hatched area is our build to zone, which is pretty broad for a kind of, sort of urban-like code. In terms of parking siting, we are requiring that the dot screen that you see there on top of the building means that parking can be located in the building a minimum of 20 feet from the front facade. So there has to be active space in there, and that really helps to make sure that that sidewalk pedestrian area is comfortable to people, and you're not walking along the fronts of cars or lights or activities. Like a lot of kind of open facades are really uncomfortable to walk in front of. You guys have done a great job with the ones that you have. But it also shows where the parking can be located on the site. And then in terms of building height, we're managing height in terms of stories with floor to floor heights per stories. And you can see the front setback, step back in the upper floor. And then in terms of facades, windows and doors, and this is specifically where the storefront glass is required on the ground floor of the storefront building, for example. So that is really building types in a nutshell. Again, each one is organized the same way, the 4 building types. So this is a little bit about the street wall variation. A couple of the discussions that we had during the working group and during the public workshops were about the public plazas, especially this one on the Cornerstone building in the bottom right-hand corner. It really breaks up that long facade and provides, gathering spaces and really helps to kind of activate the street. And then the sort of side patio on Fiddleheads, we referred to quite a bit. And so we very specifically wrote the code to on longer buildings require either a courtyard similar to that one fairly small, a little bit smaller than that one. Or an outdoor plaza, meaning you use the maximum build to zone to put kind of an open space along 50% of that front facade. So again, we're trying to kind of get a little bit more push and pull and not just a straight shot street wall. Let's see. And then to just talk a little bit about those street frontages, we do have, you'll see in the code, primary and non-primary street priorities. So we have defined, obviously Oakland and Capitol are both primary streets. Those are going to be the fronts of those buildings. But like at the intersection of Capitol and Oakland, we defined that Oakland is the primary over Capitol because those buildings actually have sides to Capitol. It doesn't mean there's still street frontages. They still have requirements associated with them, but it's just a little bit lower than the primary street. So we're trying to kind of balance our priorities again. We also have identified some locations where there's not quite a wide enough sidewalk compared to other areas within the village. And so we have this little expanded streetscape requirements called minimum streetscape area in the code. That means that if something were to redevelop, say where like the AT&T big blank building is, they would have to push back a little bit to make sure that there's enough sidewalk in that location. That doesn't really apply to very many places in Shorewood, but in terms of transitions at our districts, that was something that we talked a lot about. We have a step back story above the third floor when a parcel directly abuts an R district. In the back, we have rear and side buffers built in for vehicular areas, which is not very different from what you currently do. And then in terms of outdoor dining, like on rooftop terraces, we've said that they can't occur when they abut our districts. So that's the building types section, or the first main section that introduces the districts and the building types. Really, that's the bulk of the code and the most important towards getting that building envelope defined. Section 535-23, the table of contents is up there in the upper left-hand corner. We have defined roof types, entrance types. There's a little bit of additional information in terms of stoops and porches. You have some of that already in your existing code. We've carried some of that forward and modified it for the commercial zones because I think it was originally written really for residential. So we've been more specific there. Facade elements, and Chuck, can you stand up? We have bird-friendly design in section 535-23F. And I just want to, facade materials, facade elements. I'm going to talk about materials briefly, but facade elements are things like windows and awnings and balconies and making sure that the window glass is sort of open and not blocked up by a display, which we have seen. But bird-friendly design is a small, short section. It is modeled after Madison's regulations, and there's some reasons for that. First of all, Madison is in Wisconsin, which is really important. The Madison regulations have gone to court, and so they're, hopefully can withstand that type of situation. But they do apply to buildings that are 10,000 square feet or more, which is what's in the current draft. It applies to windows 50 square feet or larger. So the typical kind of upper story window is going to be, 3x6 or 3x8 or something like that. They wouldn't apply to most of those windows. It would mainly apply to storefronts or larger expanses of glass than just a regular double hung window in a building facade. It does require a pattern in a variety of ways. What we did try to do was make it so that it is a very straightforward regulation that requires that pattern to be applied in, a sort of handful of ways that we think are reasonable. But there is an option to go for another treatment type with design review. So it's pretty flexible in terms of that. I will say, and I think Chuck agrees with me, there are very few 10,000 square foot buildings in the village of Shorewood existing, except for the new construction that has occurred already just recently. And so this is probably not going to apply very often. One of the things that we'll be sort of talking about through the public review process is whether or not we should perhaps just remove that minimum building size and just let the minimum window size apply, which means it would probably mostly apply to storefront glass. Or we could make a 5,000 square foot, which is sort of more typical of your kind of mom and pop mixed use building size. So that we would keep it from happening there. But if something just a little bit larger were to happen, then it would apply. So those are just some things to kind of, that's probably the one item that's sort of outstanding in our sort of thought processes. And I think Chuck would agree with me. Right? Yeah. Okay, so just one of the most important sections in building design is building materials. And we very carefully had a lot of discussion about materials. We have defined major materials and minor materials. The major materials list is very short, and that's what you see on the left-hand side. It's, basically brick, high quality concrete masonry units and stone. So it is, high quality. Most buildings are likely going to be brick. Although, the CMU option, the concrete masonry units option, is a good one, and I've seen it used very well. Minor facade materials, you can see the list on the right-hand side. I mean, you can't read it, but it's a longer list, and it is to allow for a lot of flexibility in terms of that part of the design. The percentages are 65 and 35, and we've asked to use just one major material on the majority of the building, so that you're not getting these sort of really complicated facades. So I'd encourage you to take a look at the list of materials. For the most part, your new buildings are not using the minor materials, but there are some that have been used. And there is in fact a prohibited material that has been used. The prohibited list is a very short list, and it is mostly about durability. One of the things to keep in mind, I'm going to explain about adjustments, but you can ask to use any material that's on the minor material or any other material, as long as it's not on the prohibited list, as a major material with design review. So the last section in the zoning districts is 535-24. It's about landscape and site design. I'm not going to talk a lot about this because you guys already do the most important part, which is streetscape. So since that's village installed, what we're mainly focused on here are the buffers, the frontage buffers where you have vehicular areas along streets. Parking lot buffers, parking lot landscape isn't going to happen that often here. And then rear and side buffers are going to be really of limited use. So one of the aspects of this section is all of those courtyards and outdoor plazas that we talked about. We have, some sort of minimum standards that are really pretty straightforward to provide temporary seating in those or permanent seating, one or the other. And then a very small amount of landscape area within those plazas. Okay, that was zoning districts. Any questions? Let me I go on.
Questions? Okay, I do have some questions.
Oh, okay.
Is this the appropriate time?
Sure, if about zoning districts.
I think so. Let's see. So there wasn't, with conditional use, there wasn't any reduction in conditional uses. Like, has anything, we're going into that.
Yeah.
Never mind. Okay. The building to zone versus building to line. So the zone is discretionary.
No.
So explain the difference.
Sure. So the build to line is, I think you guys measure it 15 feet off the back of curb. Is that right? 15 feet off the back of curb. So the build to zone is measured from the property line depends. So on the storefront, it's, I think, 0 to 20 feet. And it's defined in the building siding section. For the general building, it's either 5 or 10 feet, depending on which GX zone you're in. Back, I think 25 or 30 feet. So that sort of 20 to 30 foot section most people are likely going to use the narrower one, which is why we put in the facade variation, because your parcels are so shallow.
Mhm.
But that does allow you to kind of go back and forth. But it is a zone that is defined by it's like a minimum setback and a maximum setback.
Right. So but it gives the design, the developer, if you will, or the property owner, it gives them the ability it gives them a maximum.
Mhm.
So, which is not something like the plan commission could interfere with or anything like that. So it's a range, but it's their choice of how they cite.
Yes. When we get to the procedures, we'll talk about the adjustments
Okay.
and the procedures, but yes.
All right.
Yes.
And then bird-friendly design, you said that it had been to court. Has it been appealed? I felt like there was
I think it's in appeal.
it's
right
in
now.
appeal.
Right?
Okay. And then with the materials list, do new materials like come on market, and I mean, I'm sure our code was like 50 years old, so I'm sure there are things that, how do municipalities address that?
So there are kind of categories, sort of like when I talk about uses. So we have composite materials that are listed. I haven't seen a lot of new materials in the past, 8 to 10 years. I've seen materials used more because they've gotten better. But there's still in some cases, there are materials that maybe shouldn't have gotten used more, even though they've gotten a little bit better. So I think the adjustment, the design adjustment that I'm going to talk about in just a minute, that I was referring to in terms of other materials. So somebody can bring forward another material to the design review process and get it approved. But I think it's very important that you review this code every year or a couple of years to make sure that it's doing what you want it to do. And, at that time, if you've gotten that other material come through as a design adjustment, 3 or 4 times, and it's been approved every time, you maybe want to revisit your list. But the code is pretty well organized so that you can, just add another line to the table and so on. So.
Thank you. No further questions.
Okay, we'll dive into uses, and then I'll talk a little bit about procedures. Okay, so the uses article, as I said before, it takes the uses section, and it takes all of the uses that are listed in each district in your current code. So under R1, it says, single family homes is allowed. Under B1, it has a list of all of the uses. So we're taking those out of the district descriptions and we're putting them all in one article, and in fact, in one table. So it's tiny, but that table is 1 page, which is magical. Sometimes I can't get away with that. And it lists all of the zoning districts in the whole village across the top, including the R zones and the P zones, which we did not touch. And then it takes all of the uses that you have in your current code, and we've kind of created a classification system that basically it simplifies and it modernizes those kind of categories of uses, so that, if we don't have hat shops anymore, maybe we should, it doesn't get you into that sort of issue of having one line item. So right now there is a retail general line item. And so any kind of retail store is just in that retail general. As I said, we did not change any of the uses that are allowed in the R zones or in fact in the P zones, even though the categories for the P zones changed a little bit. But in the commercial zones, you can see that kind of center section really uses consumer service as a broad category, general retail as a broad category. We do have donated goods retail kind of pulled out of that. Resale shops are in that general retail, but if it's resale based on donated products, then it's a separate line item because we know there's been some issues with that. You can always pull a use out of the category and give it its own line item. Your use table is going to go to another page probably, but hey. So that's the way this is organized. I think it's also really important to understand that multiple principal uses are allowed not only on a building, in a site, but also in a building. This is a mixed use code. So even though we say very specifically that medical or dental office clinics, which is its own line item because we know it's been an issue and is not currently allowed in storefronts in this code, and we had lots of discussion in the working group about this, they can occur 20 feet behind. So you could have a medical office in the back and then have another use in the front, in the storefront that's more active, and that will work. So that ground story is only in the first, I can't remember, it's 20 or 30 feet. So that's another aspect of this table that I failed to mention, which I should have, is that all those little bubbles are keys that you can see in the bottom left-hand corner. So a filled in solid bubble just means it's permitted as of right anywhere in the building or on the site. If it has a shading in the top half of the building of the bubble, it is permitted as of right in the upper stories only, but it's really the upper stories and the back behind that storefront. It's listed in the code. And then if it's vertically divided, it is permitted as of right for 25% of the building footprint. And that is mostly the GX zones, and that is just the retail and eating and drinking establishments. So in all of those blue areas on the map, we're trying to get those eating and drinking and actual retail places to, again, consolidate together so that they are working together to create active districts. We're limiting those in those building forms. So what we're doing is we're managing the uses within the buildings in this table. We're consolidating all the uses so you can kind of compare them and see how they work across all the different districts. You will also notice that that empty bubble, the conditional use permit, there are very few of them on here because with the building type regulations, there's not as much need to kind of manage how those uses occur. A lot of the conditions we find are often about how the structures are designed, but also because we're just, again, we're managing all of those uses. So each one of those bubbles has actual conditions defined in the code as well, so that they should be much easier to approve and manage. Something else, but okay. So that's principal uses, and again, you can have multiple principal uses. There are a list of accessory uses and structures. There's a subsection 2026 535-26 within the article, or a section within the article that lists accessory uses and structures in this little table. You will note that some of them say see building types. So for drive-throughs, fuel pumps, those are really key to the building type, how the building type is designed and how it looks. And so there's actually a little key in the building type tables that says whether or not they're allowed. But what we've done is we've created supplemental regulations for several of these, even if they're allowed by right, like drive-through facilities in CX. We have design standards so that they are located on the rear or the interior side of the building. As well as fuel pumps. Outdoor dining is still a conditional use, and we have some language associated with that. Outdoor sales and displays, we had a lot of discussion about, and there are standards associated with that. And solar energy systems are now allowed by right everywhere with standards associated with them. And the standards are mainly associated with, mounting them on buildings. But wind energy is still a conditional use permit. Other customary accessory uses, so anything that is customary is clearly outlined how it would be defined as a customary accessory use. And there has to be a principal use associated with it. But then it would be allowed in any zone if it is customary to that use. And then there are definitions about where it can occur, mostly in the rear. There is also a temporary use section in that article, which is basically follows your current, but I think defines the amount of time that some of those temporary uses can occur a little bit differently. Okay, so procedures is really important section. We had a lot of discussions about how projects are reviewed. And what we did was we tried to line out how you're currently reviewing things and create separate sections that outline them. So you can see that we have a project review application section, zoning review, design review. Some of this is a little bit different for the working group because we've like sort of fleshed it out a little bit more. And then we have two adjustment types that I've been referring to. We have a planning adjustment type and a design adjustment. And the planning adjustment is for the Plan Commission to review and approve. And the design adjustment is for the Design Review Board to review and approve. The planning adjustment is a sort of minor dimensional relief, 10% or up to 1 foot to all of the building type regulations. So when I sort of did a little bit of hesitation about the build to zone, 10% or 1 foot could get a planning adjustment. So that's a little minor. I will say that usually those minor planning adjustments are zoning administrator approved because they're so minor. But we left it in here and maybe you guys could, review that later and decide to just let the zoning administrator do that because it's so minor. But there are a couple of other, I say use related, they don't have anything to do with the uses article. They have to do with, for example, open doors or when the windows being blocked up. We called those use related. So the Plan Commission reviews those. So they are called out very specifically in the code as you can get a planning adjustment for this. Same thing with design adjustments. There are design adjustments allowed to almost each section within the building design section, each subsection. However, they are, again, very clearly defined. You can get a design adjustment for this, and the Design Review Board can review it. So it's not a kind of broad, overarching ability to do something significantly different. What you'll find in the procedure section is this flow chart that at first might look a little complicated, but hopefully the color coding helps. The green bubbles are about the sort of initial zoning review. And this is actually, I think, what Bart does today anyway. We're just sort of codifying it all. So anytime he gets an occupancy permit to do a use review, he's looking at the current zoning to see if it meets the zoning. And so that's what this review process is about. And then he either says, yes, that's allowed by the code, it's approved, or there's conditions associated with it, or he rejects it because it's not an allowed use or something like that. So this whole sort of green section is a zoning administrator review to make sure that whatever it is in that project review application, no matter what, is meeting the code as written, the zoning code as written. At the point of his review, the application should say whether or not they're asking for a planning adjustment for those few things. If they are asking for a planning adjustment at that stage, it goes to the Plan Commission for approval. And that is the blue that you see on the right-hand side. So that is planning adjustments reviewed by the Plan Commission. And if they review it and approve it, then it goes, if it needs to, it goes to the zoning administrator in number 3 to begin that pink process, which is the design review. I think that's supposed to be like a purple, but it's like pink. Sorry, Scott. Design Review Board has pink. But design review would then occur pretty much as it does right now. And this is pulled from 225-12, which is in the building section of your code and not in zoning, but it's really zoning related. And the idea here is that the zoning administrator reviews it first to make sure that it meets the code, because now the code is all design standards. Instead of it being the central district design guidelines that the Design Review Board is reviewing, the zoning administrator reviews it based on the code, goes down and check marks all of the elements that we have in the code, and whether or not the project meets it. At that same point in time, they're looking at the application if they've requested a design adjustment. The design adjustment and the design review process occur concurrently. So it's the same process for the developer. If the project is just the way that you currently do it, if the project is new commercial mixed use or multi-unit residential buildings, they're required to hold 2 meetings, but everything else is just 1 meeting. That's the way it's done today, right? So that process is, again, very similar to what happens, but I think what's really important to note is that the criteria for design review now places greater emphasis on the actual code compliance because all of the design is written into the code. So this is the process that's like written out in the procedures section. I will also note that we have increased the notice distances slightly, and we've also increased the notice timing with discussions from the working group. Oops, on computer. So I just want to end it by saying, this is all about a balancing process. We're talking about trying to create really objective and predictable regulations, but we are also trying to put in some discrete relief mechanisms. So making sure that there is a way to kind of get to what you want. We do have very simplified use categories, and we've reduced the number of conditional uses. But in return, we've also allowed more flexibility in terms of those mixed uses. It's geographically based, but it is, a flexible mix of uses. You can do more things in your building than you could before. We have hopefully reduced costs for developers' process to get through the procedures because the regulations are much clearer and easier to design to. And then to submit for, and you have some level of predictability in terms of the design review board is going to follow the code. But hopefully what we've done is taken some of that money and used it for high quality design and more durability in terms of design, especially on the primary and street facades of the building. And then finally, we are focused on the more easily obtainable sustainability elements, being very aware of costs associated with them. But again, we've got, walkability being very much a primary focus, which does a great deal in terms of sustainability. But our goal of durability, adaptability, and affordability hopefully will help, these buildings to last a longer time, which is a huge sustainability goal. And last but really not least, again, this balance is about, this is every place that I work. We want to reflect the character of Shorewood, but we're designing for the future. So we've got to kind of make sure that we're balancing and grabbing, some of that character, but keeping in mind, new materials that come on hand and, more people moving here or whatever it is that, we want to make sure that we're allowing for the future. So again, that sort of balance. Hopefully we've struck a good balance. I think the working group has worked really hard to help define that. So I guess maybe let's stop there and we can ask questions and then maybe we can talk about next steps.
Questions or comments?
When we look at the flow chart that you have worked out about the process for someone who wants to develop or redevelop a building here, it looks like it's going to be much more straightforward, and that a lot of the things where we don't know what it's going to look like, we won't run into that anymore because Bart's going to kind of take those proposals, apply them against the code, and either they're going to fit or they're going to not fit. And there's, not that much room. There's some, but not a whole wide room for deviations. So it seems like a much simpler, less work for the plan commission, but much simpler process for everyone involved. Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Thank
you.
Good job.
Other comments? A clap? You want to do Yeah, it's a huge accomplishment. Any comments from the working group members that are here? I'm going to direct Scott as chair of the design review board. Any? Mhm. That's great. Anyone else who'd like to be heard this evening? Yes. Yeah. Come up and name and address, and that microphone in particular is very hard to be heard. So talk really loud.
A lot of things I would have asked for had I known it was like right. Yeah, so that is a few things. I was overall in housing. Portable farming for 10. My own house I bought in 2020. Beyond the price. Housing that probably makes a bigger difference. For you know, not going no for I probably could have got on any further. Second comment on electric vehicle supply. I think this might be easier to understand. So intentionally. That's really codes with charging which should probably be not regulated someday in the future.
Thank you. Did you get those notes? That's great. I was actually just went to the League of Wisconsin Municipalities conference last week. I know you're all jealous. And attended a panel on electrification and all the federal funds that are coming, kind of what that all means. And it was really interesting, and there are going to be a lot of opportunities. So for all of you who have been saying, let's get ready, the guidelines aren't even out yet, but I think that we can get funding for strategic planning, and I'm excited to work on that across the state. So. All right, next.
So we were just going to kind of end on next steps. We have a public open house scheduled for November 16th, which is a Wednesday, in a couple of weeks. And I think, I can't remember what the time of it is, but it's, I think,
4 to 7.
Thank you. He's already put all the flyers up. I couldn't believe today. And I will basically be here with posters and copies of the code. And we're going to set up. I'm not sure where we're setting it.
Right here in the courtroom and
here.
possibly the hallway if we need extra space.
Okay. And the idea is that people can just come and ask questions. So if you have neighbors that want to just come talk about the code or ask specific questions, we'll be there for 3 hours.
You don't have to stay for 3 hours.
No, just open house, walk
But you
in,
can.
talk.
If you want to.
Yeah. You can. Well, It's supposed to be kind of more one-on-one. So as people kind of walk
Ah.
in, wander in, we can have conversations, or little group conversations. So
Okay, sounds good.
you could listen to all the conversations if you wanted.
Okay, I was just putting it in my calendar before I forget. I'm not texting. All right, anything else?
I think that's it.
Yeah, and then after the public open house, we'll reconvene the plan commission obviously at some point to seek a recommendation and take it to the village board with the more formal public hearing kind of process. But we're just kind of in the opening stage of this refining phase. So hopefully what we presented here makes everything understandable, legible so that people either live or in the recording can look at the code and review it and come to the public open house or email me any questions or comments they have that we can all consolidate for future review. So kicking this off, hopefully we get a lot of people interested and engaged that we can, take them through the approval process with us.
It's great.
I have a question about how will the public comments be captured, shared?
At the public open house
At the
or in
open
general?
house, just generally speaking.
I mean, generally, if they're emailed to me, I'll be compiling those. So I did receive 2 already. They weren't necessary for discussion necessarily tonight because we weren't agended for discussion, but I do have 2 public comments. So if anyone here or listening live or the recording, definitely email me those comments. I would defer to Leslie in terms of whether or not there's going to be.
Yeah, so we'll have little cards for people to write general comments as well as post-it notes. And I'll have markers, and we'll literally have boards of the code so that people can come and talk about different aspects of it and just put either their post-it notes, or I will put post-it notes, or we'll mark them up, with markers on them. And then, we'll make a list of all of those sort of post-its. I'll also ask people to email Bart if they have longer, discussion points that they want to.
And that'll be shared.
Yep, that compilation will be given to the plan commission alongside either this draft or the second review draft, depending on the breadth of those comments. If they're not substantial, it's possible we could do it, alongside. If they are substantial, or we need to take more time to refine this first draft more, it all depends. We don't know what those comments are going to be yet, so we're hesitant to give an exact roadmap of that. But we'll know definitely more after the 16th public open house.
But I would expect, kind of following up on that, and I don't know if this is where you were going, but I would not expect that somebody could come to the open house and say, I think you should add, 8 stories at the corner of Oakland, and you'd be like, oh, okay, let me make that change. So that's not, the comments will come in. There might be tweaks that are made because they just made sense. But anything substantive would come to the plan commission for consideration for working into a draft.
Correct.
All right. Any other questions on that? Okay. And then procedure wise, when we reconvene around at the conclusion of the public process, then at that point, we don't have a hearing at this level, right? It's just at the village board level.
Correct. The public
We make
hearing
a
is the board
recommendation.
level. Yep.
Okay, great. I see some members of the public on the virtual meeting. Is there anyone who would like to be heard at this time? All right, I'm not seeing any hands. So thank you. We will conclude this agenda item and move on to the next one, which is, I don't have my agenda up. It is something about a public participation.
Correct. This is my item. So
Oh.
it's agendized as consideration of recommendation of a public participation plan to update the Village of Shorewood's comprehensive plan 2040 in conjunction with the commercial zoning update. And I have a brief presentation here, but essentially what Leslie presented with us tonight, is largely based on the comprehensive plan. At the same time, it's got more nuance than what the comprehensive plan suggested. And so if we were to adopt this current version of the code, we would also need to adopt an update to the comprehensive plan. In order to do that, we need to have a public participation plan that confirms that we are, reaching out to the public to make sure they're aware of the possible changes. And so hopefully I'm sharing my screen here now. Just a brief. Okay. So yeah, the Shorewood Comprehensive Plan 2040 was adopted in April 19th, 2021. It included future land use map with 4 central district subcategories. Can't see my screen. Oh, okay. It also did recommend the form-based corridor planning study. So that's the phase that we're in right now is we're looking at that particular study. The commercial zoning update recommends the zoning scheme more nuanced than the future land use map. So this is the future land use map in the comprehensive plan. As you can see, there's much less nuance. It's more blocks of color. So the purple district was defined as mixed use Main Street. The orange district to the south was residential. The more lavender kind of purple to the west was suburban, more auto-centric development. And then the purple on the east side of Capitol, once again, was also mixed use Main Street. So it was much more contiguous and defined. And within that, there was text descriptions of each of them. So the narrative descriptions on page 173 through 174 do not align specifically with the current draft of the zoning scheme and map. In particular, in the Main Street mixed use district, Central Core mixed use district, and suburban mixed use district. I won't ask you to read the whole description, but the highlighted section in each of those narratives does say that ground floor non-residential development is required. As Leslie just presented to you, we have general buildings that are allowed in those districts in the current proposal that don't require commercial storefronts. And so the comprehensive plan was much more kind of blunt or general in suggesting that we could or should have that level of commercial activity. Whereas this, through the public engagement and through Leslie's expertise, has gotten a more nuanced approach to that. So with that, this is what I mentioned, what Leslie has drafted. And so those blue areas do not require that ground store commercial use. And so if we were to adopt this, we would need to have a text amendment to the comprehensive plan. In order to amend your comprehensive plan, you have to adopt first a public participation plan. And so we'd be looking to do that for these potential text updates. The public participation plan would run alongside the public review efforts of this commercial zoning update. So we already have a project website. We would just make it more defined in the project website of this particular need. The open house on November 16th would have a board specific to that particular reason and why we think it's a necessary amendment. We would do outreach via social media and village managers memo alongside other efforts as well. Plan commission, you would ultimately recommend whether or not to go with that amendment. And so once again, it'd just be alongside the commercial zoning update. Village board would also require public hearing and consideration. And so it's pretty much using the same process that we have outlined for the zoning update itself. And so within that process, if for some reason the zoning update defines that we don't need this amendment, we wouldn't need it. But if we keep going with what we have, we definitely need to do both. And so based on your potential recommendation, the village board would consider adopting this public participation plan via resolution on November 7th. And so that's pretty much the reasoning for why this has been put in your packet, is that we just need to make sure that what we adopt aligns with the comprehensive plan. I'd be happy to take any questions if there are any at this time.
Any questions?
I have a question. So it sounds like we'll move these two projects along simultaneously. So it's not like we'll wrap up zoning code and then wrap up the update on the comp plan later. We'll do them kind of at the same time.
Yep, they would be simultaneous, and actually the comp plan would need to be updated as the first agenda item before you're allowed to adopt an ordinance. So any ordinance that it's adopted needs to be consistent with the comprehensive plan. So if this goes to the board on, March 1st, agenda item 1 is going to be updating the comprehensive plan. Agenda item 2 is going to be adopting the code. So that the first part needs to happen first.
And it's largely kind of a housekeeping. It's not.
Correct. It's a text amendment. There's not much more to it than that. And so as long as the public agrees that the current code is what we want,
Right.
It makes sense that it shouldn't have any.
Bearing on the
Yeah.
other. Mhm. Okay. Any other comments or questions?
There was one member of the public, Mr. Walsh, did you want to speak on that item?
Yeah, Bart, could you explain again precisely why or what section of the comprehensive plan needs to be changed and how in order to meet the requirements of this new commercial zoning? There was a long conversation and I didn't quite, or not, there was a long description of what needed to be done, and I couldn't quite follow what required the change.
Sure. Are you able to see the screen, Dan?
Yeah. I am.
And if you
Um,
could just state your name and address, please, Mr. Walsh.
Yeah, you bet. This is Daniel Walsh. I live at 4024 North Stowell Avenue.
So yeah, on pages 173 and 174 of the current comprehensive plan in the land use chapter, the future land use subcategories.
What I see on my screen, it just says Plan Commission, October 25th.
Oh, it's not advancing the slides. Okay. Can you see them this way without me showing the presentation?
I can now, I couldn't previously. That's why I was raising my hand.
Still just the main slide on this version?
Now it's still the main slide, but whatever
I'm sorry,
you
I'm
did,
having problems here. My internet connection is not great.
it is not advancing. It wasn't advanced. Now I can see it.
Okay, now you can see a map.
Yeah, I can see the land use map now.
Okay, sorry about that. I didn't realize the slides weren't.
Yeah,
So this is just text that I pretty much read, but this is the current future land use map in the comprehensive plan. And it shows much more grouped blocks of coloring. So the purple is Main Street mixed use district. The orange below is residential, and the blue on the west end of town would be more suburban auto-centric commercial uses. So the comprehensive plan had these more general uses, but the draft that we are working with here with the commercial zoning update has these more nuanced versions where we have nodes of commercial activity, but the blue sections of this actually don't require commercial ground store uses. So these blue areas would need to be updated in the comprehensive plan, because this kind of section here, narrative descriptions on page 173 through 174, each of those subcategories has this kind of description of what it is. In the very final sentence of the Main Street mixed use district, which is the same as the central core and suburban mixed use district, says that ground floor non-residential development is required in this area. We'd be looking, if the community is in line with the commercial zoning update, we'd be looking to remove this section, understanding that the sentence, understanding that the recommended zoning part of it says changes to existing zoning districts and or form-based standards are envisioned. We would be adopting those form-based standards, which don't necessarily require that ground floor non-residential. So once again, we'd have this explained, without throughout the update process. But these sentences in these three sections would need to be either amended or removed in order to adopt the plan as drafted.
As drafted today, and that's just again, there were lots of districts that I want to spend some more time looking at, those GX districts. Not that what I say or ever think goes anywhere, but my understanding is that there is still quite a bit of requirement, even those blue areas, that the ground floor area be in the district plan, in these blue areas, that the ground floor needs to be a commercial use. Or is that completely wrong? In any of these dark blue and blue areas, the commercial floor, the first floor does not need to be commercial use?
It could be fully residential or fully office. It would not need to be a storefront commercial use.
But the parking can't be on the ground floor.
Correct.
Within 20 feet of the front of the building.
Correct.
And does that primary facade in that 20 feet, does that also apply to corner buildings, both streets, or would it only apply to the primary facade? That 20 feet?
Just the primary facade.
Yeah. And is there any demonstration of what would go in those spaces and how usable those spaces would be if we create 20-foot spaces in the front of the buildings?
I'll defer to Leslie on that.
So it's minimum 20 feet. And again, it can be any of the allowed uses in the ground floor. So
I understand, but here's my question are there models, are there buildings and uses that will fit within 20 feet of depth?
yes, absolutely. I will say that I used to do 30 feet. because that was the size of a residential unit. But as residential units have gotten smaller, as well as retail units have gotten smaller, we sort of switched to that minimum 20 feet. It also allows for a little bit more flexibility in the building form. But yes, absolutely. Again, the idea here is that there's a definition of occupied space
Mhm.
in the regulations, and that's what has to be within that 20 feet. So it is meant to be people occupied space by any use.
Got it. Got it. I don't doubt that could be right. I just have a hard time seeing how 20 feet of depth would work for the vast majority of commercial uses. I could see how it potentially could work for a residential use, but we've handled lots and lots of small retail spaces, and I don't see that as a practical leasing. And my worry is that in many of the developments that have happened all along in metro and suburban Milwaukee over the past 3 decades, often there's a requirement that ground floor retail be a part of the development, but the developers are so excited to get the upper floors done that what they build is terrible ground floor retail, and then it sits vacant for many, many, many years, and then they blame the municipality for its requirements, even though they just built a terrible asset. So when the zoning code should reflect a very high quality ground floor asset that would be in demand rather than just a particular size. So I would just, like, we'll get to the comments later, but I think that part needs some work. And there's really good evidence that would suggest it needs some work.
Yeah, I actually think that's a great point, and we'll just work towards confirming what those uses could look like and when they're required. But I do think that's a great point in terms of, we're not wanting to require spaces that can't be occupied, because the whole goal of the code is to have that, ground level vibrancy. So I'll defer to Leslie if she has more information on that, but I think it is something that we'd be happy to further explore and document and show how that can work.
Thanks.
Anyone else? Oh, Barbara Kylie Miller.
When I think about those smaller retail spaces, I think about some of those buildings that we have just west of Oakland on Capitol, like the surf shop or the shoe shop next to it, or maybe they're a startup company and they can't afford or they don't want to have that larger retail space. So I think it's good for the village to offer a variety, because then you're going to get more variety of businesses.
Thank you. Any other members of the public who would like to be heard? All right, I think that concludes this agenda item.
I was looking for a recommendation if possible.
Yes.
I'd like to move approval of this recommendation.
I'll second.
Motion by Commissioner Flynn Post, seconded by Commissioner Kylie Miller. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries 6 of us, right? Yeah, 6-0. Thank you. All right, thank you. Moving on to item 5, future agenda items. Hearing none. Item 6, motion to adjourn.
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Second. Did you fall asleep there for a minute?
No, I just felt awkward.
Okay. Motion to adjourn by Commissioner Wicklund, seconded by Commissioner Klein. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? We are now adjourned at 8:01. Thank you, everyone.